Alright. Alright, so we're going to talk about the Seminole gear system here. So we'll begin by going over the parts that make up the gear system, then we'll go into how the gear is raised, we'll talk about how it gets lowered, and finally how it gets lowered in an emergency. So starting up here at the top of this screen and this diagram, we have the combination pump and reservoir. So like I just said, it's a combination of a pump and a reservoir. So it houses the hydraulic fluid and it pumps or provides the pressure for the system. It's located through an access door in the baggage compartment. So if you open up the baggage compartment door, and then on the back of the baggage compartment there's going to be a smaller door that you can open up. Pop that open and you'll have this small little pump there. Okay? Now this hydraulic fluid is full of MIL PRF 5606 hydraulic fluid, and to check the levels we'll remove the filler plug / dipstick, and then we'll be able to note how full it is on there, just like we would with checking the oil before the flight. Pull the dipstick and it'll tell us how much oil's in there, and then for the hydraulic system, pull the dipstick out and we'll be able to check how much hydraulic fluid's in there. So we should do this every 50 hours as is recommended by Piper. Alright, so moving on, we have our hydraulic lines that allow fluid out, and then lines that allow fluid in. So we have them marked here. So the bigger ones, the ones on the outside, these allow fluid back into the reservoir, and then the shorter ones right here in the middle, these allow fluid out of the reservoir. Then we have our bleed hole up here at the top. Now the bleed hole is here in case there's any condensation or anything that builds up in the system. It's allowed to leak out of the system into here. We have our thermal relief. Obviously, if there needs to be some expansion due to heat expansion, it's going to be able to go back into this thermal relief, go back into the reservoir, so it doesn't build up a dangerous amount of pressure in these hydraulic lines. Here in the middle we have our pump. This provides the pressure for the system. Then we have the shuttle valve, and note that this is electrically driven. So if we have some sort of electrical failure, this hydraulic pump right here, this electrically driven hydraulic pump, is not on the emergency battery bus, so we will lose this if we lose battery power and our alternators. That's why we have the emergency freefall gear system, which I'll get into later. So moving on down here, we have our shuttle valve. Now this thing will move left and right depending on where the cockpit control switch is. So again, there's a switch in the cockpit right next to the throttle quadrant on the pilot side. It's a little black, looks like a tire almost. It's a little black tire, and you pull it out and bring it up to bring the gear up, pull it out and bring it down to bring the gear down. So depending on where that is, that'll control how the shuttle valve moves. So as we can see, it's kind of marked here as well. It has these openings throughout the shuttle valve. It has 4 openings or 4 canals or channels in the shuttle valve, and depending on where this is, it'll allow hydraulic fluid either down or it'll allow it back up depending on where it is, and we'll get into that when I show you how the gear is raised and lower. Moving on down there, we have the Piper mounting base. From there we have our hydraulic chambers, left and a right hydraulic chamber. We have a restrictor here on this right hydraulic chamber, and then there's a pressure switch over here, and then this pressure switch, that'll be another way to control when the pump here gets shut off. Alright, moving on down. From these hydraulic chambers we have lines going to each of these hydraulic gear cylinders. Alright, so if we follow here, this one goes to the top. All 3 of these hydraulic gear cylinders are connected or plumbed to this hydraulic chamber, and these chambers have hydraulic lines that go to the top, okay? And then if we look on the right one here, This one has plumbed to the bottom of the hydraulic cylinders. Alright, so again, this one right here, this hydraulic chamber, feeds hydraulic fluid into the top of the gear cylinders, and then this one on the right here feeds hydraulic fluid into the bottom of the gear cylinders. Okay. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. So also not noted on this diagram, but I think it's in my presentation later. There's going to be a spring for each of these three gear apparatus that helps bring it into the downlock position. There are downlock hooks for each of these three. Then there's going to be up limit, down limit switches, and then squat switches on the two main gear. So that's another part of the system there. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Alright, very good. So that's an overview of the components of the system. Now we'll go into some of the indications we'll get in the cockpit on our G1000. So starting up here at the top left, if the gear is down and locked, we'll see 3 green circles in the cockpit, and again, this is going to be found on the PFD. To the right here, if our landing gear is up, we'll have these white circles with the empty or black inside of them. Lower left, if the landing gear is moving either up or down, we're going to have squares and with the hash marks. And then over to the right here, if there's some sort of failure in the system, we're going to get this red, right? So when we're coming into land, we want to do gear checks. We're looking for 3 green, no red, 1 in the mirror. So those are your 3 things. You're checking 3 green, you say no red, and then 1 in the mirror. And again, there's going to be a mirror on the left nacelle. It's a pretty small mirror. It's probably the size of maybe a baseball in diameter, located right on the left nacelle there, so you could see that front nose gear if it's down. It can be kind of difficult at night, so you may need to bank the planer a little bit and look for the movement of the white strut. But during the day, it's really easy to see that nose gear in that mirror. So again, 3 green, no red, 1 in the mirror, gears down. And then if you're working in a crew environment, you'd say verify, and then your co-pilot would look at 3 green, yep, no red, and yep, 1 in the mirror, gear down, verified. Alright, let's look at the electrical system that's tied into the landing gear. So we have the G1000 that it's all feeding to. We have the right squat. So squat, pretty easy to memorize this. Think about squatting. So if the airplane is on the ground, it's not going anywhere, it's parked, it's kind of squatting. It's kind of weird to think about, but that's kind of what it's doing. It's just squatting there. So these squat switches, and let's see here, we've got 1 on the right and then 1 on the left. Yep, that's it. So only 2 squat switches, and what these do is it doesn't allow the gear to transit up while the gear is down, or while the plane is on the ground. So while there's pressure on that squat switch, so the landing gear has the struts, and while it's on the ground, obviously the weight of the airplane is pushing down on those struts, compresses it to the point where the squat switch will contact, that closes the circuit, feeds the information to the G1000 that indeed the airplane is on the ground, and to not activate the hydraulic pump to bring that gear up or to cycle that gear up. So that's a squat switch, again, 1 on the right and 1 on the left. We have the up limit switches. So when the gear is coming up, it'll hit this up limit switch, that'll close the circuit, and it'll run through the G1000, and then we'll have the hydraulic pump turn off. And it'll also give us that cockpit indication that the gear is up. So again, we have an up limit on the right. You can see R up limit. We have a L up limit, and then we have a nose up limit. So up limit switches on all 3 of the gear. Then we have R, D, N lock. So right down lock. So this would mean that the gear is down and the down lock hooks are in. So again, it's the same thing. There's a down limit switch. So once it's fully extended, there's going to be a contactor that connects, closes the circuit, feeds the information to the G1000, and again the hydraulic pump will turn off, and we'll have our gear down. So again, we have a right down lock, we have a left down lock, and then we have a nose down lock as well. Like I talked about, we have the gear selector in the cockpit. That's about all I want to talk about here. And then we can see the hydraulic pump here. That's pretty good. Alright, what are we going on to? Alright, raising the gear. So the first thing we're going to do when we're raising the gear is we're going to grab that cockpit control and again pull it out and bring it up into the up position. That hydraulic pump will engage. Okay, the shuttle valve is going to move to the left here, and it's going to allow this high pressure, because the pump is running, this hydraulic fluid will be pressurized. And one thing while we're talking about this, don't think about a high pressure and a low pressure side. They're both of these lines have a lot of pressure in them. It's like 1700 psi and then 1300 psi. So it's not like when you start raising the gear, and I have it marked here in blue, would be the relatively higher pressure side. It's not like there's zero pressure here in the left and it's just kind of trickling out. No, it's 1300 psi of pressure, which is quite a bit, which we'll get into later why that's a big deal. But it's just something that when you're going through an oral with someone, or you're trying to explain the system to one of your instructors or a check ride examiner down the road, you don't want to say high pressure and low pressure, because there's really no such thing as low pressure in the system unless there's some sort of failure and the fluid has drained out of it. It's relatively high pressure and relatively low pressure, because both of these are pretty high pressure. Alright, so now that we kind of have that generally understood. So the pump turns on, fluid is allowed out of the reservoir. Again, the shuttle valve moves to the left, so the fluid is able to go through this very far right channel, goes down here into this right hydraulic chamber here, and then as we saw earlier, the right chamber directs fluid to the bottoms of these three cylinders. I wish that wouldn't pop up. Darn it all. Well, bottom of that right cylinder there, and then bottom or nose gear cylinder, and then bottom of this other main gear cylinder. So as you could imagine, if we have 1700 psi of pressure below this piston right here, and again this is a piston that's connected to the tires, if we have 1700 psi underneath this piston and only 1300 psi above this piston, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to force this piston up, right? So it's going to force this piston up, and while this piston is moving up, it's going to be pushing this fluid out the top of these cylinders back into this hydraulic chamber. And again, this is happening with all three of these simultaneously. So it's pushing the hydraulic fluid back up through these lines into the hydraulic chamber, back up through the shuttle valve. Again, this shuttle valve is moved, so this is allowed up through this left middle chamber, I guess, or the second chamber, or canal. So it goes up through here, and then goes right back into the reservoir. The gear's coming up. It's going to hit that up limit switch, this pressure switch. Well, it should be at 1700. So it's going to hit that up limit switch, and the hydraulic pump will turn off. We'll have the 3 green indication if we're bringing the gear up, we'll have this indication. And there you go. So you've just raised your gear. Alright. Now let's talk about lowering the gear. So lowering the gear, again, it's going to start off in the same place. You're going to take that cockpit control right next to the throttle quadrant on the pilot side. You're going to bring that down, okay? Bring it down. Once you bring that down, this hydraulic pump is going to engage. Hydraulic fluid is going to be drawn out of this right line right here, pressurized in the pump. This shuttle valve is going to move to the right this time. This high pressure fluid is going to be allowed to go through this far left canal here or opening into the left hydraulic chamber. And again, if we remember, the left hydraulic chamber has lines connecting to the tops of these hydraulic gear cylinder heads. Okay, so it's going to go into the top of these heads simultaneously into these three. 1700 psi going into the top. We only have 1300 psi in the bottom, so what's going to happen? It's going to push this piston down. As it pushes it down, we're going to have the fluid drain or be pushed out the bottoms of these cylinders and into this right hydraulic chamber, up through this this hydraulic line here, up through the right middle canal in the shuttle valve, and back up into the reservoir. The down lock, how the gear locks into place when you bring it down is there's a spring that engages. It's a pretty thick gauge spring. I think I have a diagram of where it is. Yep. So this spring right here brings the helps bring the gear into the down lock position, and then we have down lock hooks right here that lock it in place. So those hooks bring it down. Then we have the down lock limit switches, which feed information to the G1000, gives us our cockpit indication that the landing gear is down and locked 3 green. And then the hydraulic pump turns off, and what do you know? You've lowered your gear. Alright, now let's talk about emergency gear extend. So, just like I was saying before, imagine you had a scenario where lost your alternators and you had to get to an airport that was decently far away, so you've drained your main battery and you're running off of the emergency battery. Only your emergency battery bus is getting energy or current, and unfortunately, or fortunately, this hydraulic pump here isn't on that bus. So, we're not going to be able to lower the gear normally. So we need some way to do it manually. Some airplanes, they'll actually have a pump, like the, what is it? One of those Cessnas, the high-wing Cessna. Golly, what is it? 182, I think? Maybe? I don't know. 180, I don't know what it is. But they'll actually have a hand pump, and you could bring the gear down that way. We don't have that in the Seminole. So we have this emergency free fall gear valve. Alright? So how this works, in this scenario, the gear is going to be up, right? Because we're trying to extend it. So if the gear is up, that means that we have relatively higher pressure holding the gear up, and so the bottoms of these cylinders are going to be full of that, like 1700 psi pressure, 1700, and then we'll have 13 in these lines up above. So again, if we've got 1700 psi coming through to each of these, this emergency freefall gear valve is also wired or plumbed to this hydraulic chamber here, the higher pressure hydraulic chamber. So this is going to have 1700 psi in here, and then we're going to have 1300 coming into the hydraulic chamber on the left side here. So what happens is we pull this, and in the cockpit there's a little red knob that has like a little metal bar across the top of it. So you bring that metal bar down to allow you to bring it out. So once that metal bar is down, you grab the knob, pull it. As you can see, there's a knob here. Pull it, and what that does is essentially equalize this pressure. So it allows this 1700 to start pushing against this 1300 into this hydraulic chamber, and it equalizes the pressure throughout the system. So what happens if we have equal pressure throughout the system? Well, gravity's going to take over. Right? So if gravity takes over, this gear is allowed to slowly kind of fall down. Those downlock springs are going to help bring it into the downlock position. The hooks are going to engage, and then we'll have the downlock switches give us the 3 green indication in the cockpit. Now, something that we should be aware of is that if we're really hauling, right, if we're going like 160, the airflow beneath those tires may be so great that there's so much resistance that the gear may not actually come down. So you may want to slow down enough to where that air resistance underneath the wing is less, so the gear can actually be able to overcome that pressure and fall down. I think that's all I got for you guys. Sources was just the Piper Seminole AFM there. So back there in section, what would it be, 6? Section 6, and then I believe 8 as well. So there you go. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.